At 27 years old, Ilia Topuria became the first undefeated two-division champion in UFC history. But that statistic alone doesn't explain how terrifying he really was. Because Prime Ilia Topuria wasn't just winning fights. He was knocking out legends, dismantling former champions, and walking through Hall of Famers like they were nothing. It didn't matter who stood across from him. For 5 years, 17 fights in a row, nobody could find the answer. And what made it so unbelievable was the confidence. Topuria didn't just believe he would win. He told you exactly how. He called the round. He called the finish. And then he did it anyway. Ilia Topuria didn't fight like a normal contender working his way up. He fought like a man who already knew how the story ended. Too heavy-handed for the strikers, too well-rounded for the grapplers, too composed for the chaos. At his peak, facing Ilia Topuria felt less like fighting an opponent and more like fighting a prophecy that refused not to come true. In this video, we'll talk about how good Prime Ilia Topuria really was, how a kid born in Germany to Georgian parents ended up becoming Spain's biggest combat sports star, why his style made him one of the most complete fighters of his generation, how he tore through 2 divisions without ever tasting defeat, and why, even after everything changed on one night in Washington, Prime Ilia Topuria still deserves to be talked about as one of the most dominant champions the sport has produced. And it all started long before the UFC, before the 2 belts, before the chants of Matador rang out in Anaheim and Las Vegas. Ilia Topuria was just a kid with 3 countries pulling at him at once. Born in Halle, Germany in 1997 to Georgian parents, his childhood didn't look anything like the typical fighter's origin story. When he was 7, his family moved to Georgia, and that's where he first started Greco-Roman wrestling, the foundation that would later make him so much more than just a striker. Then, at 15, everything shifted again. His family relocated to Alicante, Spain, and that's where the version of Topuria the world would eventually fear was actually built. He started training at the Climate Club, and somewhere in those gyms, the identity of El Matador was born. Not just a nickname, a persona, a fighter who saw himself as the one delivering the final blow, every single time. Topuria turned professional in 2015, and from the very beginning, he simply did not lose. He built his record fight by fight in smaller promotions, sharpening tools that most prospects don't have this early. Real wrestling pedigree, a black belt level of jiu-jitsu, and increasingly, fists that could end a fight out of nowhere. By the time he signed with the UFC in 2020, he was already unbeaten, already confident, and already talking like a champion before he'd fought a single could even threaten the finish he was famous for. That win alone turned heads, because beating Ryan Hall at his own game, before his own game even started, is the kind of statement most fighters never get to make. Then came Jai Herbert, and this fight revealed something just as important as the wins themselves: what Topuria looked like when things went wrong. Herbert dropped him with a head kick in the first round, hurt him, tagged him more than once while he tried to recover. For a moment, it looked like the unbeaten record might finally be in real jeopardy. Topuria didn't panic. He survived the round, reset in the corner, and came out in the second, looking like nothing had happened. Then he found the finish that put Herbert away completely. That single sequence told the story of his entire prime. Get hurt, adjust, come back colder than before, and finish the job anyway. By the time he faced Bryce Mitchell, an undefeated grappler with a reputation for being a problem on the mat, people had stopped assuming Topuria was just a striker with power. Against Mitchell, he proved it conclusively, locking in an arm triangle choke for the submission. Wrestlers, strikers, grapplers. It didn't matter what shape the threat came in, Topuria had an answer. Then came Josh Emmett, a fight that earned Fight of the Night honors and pushed Topuria's record to 14-0. The hype was no longer building quietly. It was becoming impossible to ignore. The UFC's featherweight division, stacked with killers, suddenly had one undefeated name that everybody had to discuss. And then came February 17th, 2024, UFC 298. Alexander Volkanovski, the reigning featherweight champion, widely considered one of the greatest 145-pounders to ever compete, a pound-for-pound fixture, a wrestler-striker hybrid who had beaten everybody in front of him for years. Topuria didn't just believe he could beat him. It wasn't just a win. It was a changing of the guard, broadcast in real time, exactly as advertised beforehand by the man who called it. That alone would have been a career-defining moment for most fighters. For Topuria, it was simply the beginning of his championship era. His first title defense came against Max Holloway, the BMF champion, a legend of the featherweight division who had never been finished at 145 pounds in his entire career. Not once, not by anyone. On October 26, 2024, at UFC 308, Topuria became the first man to ever finish Max Holloway at featherweight, knocking him out and silencing any remaining doubt about whether the Volkanovski win was a fluke. It wasn't a fluke, it was a pattern. And then Topuria made a decision that very few champions in UFC history have ever made. He didn't wait around to pad his legacy at featherweight. He vacated the belt and moved up to lightweight, a heavier, deeper, more dangerous division, chasing more history instead of protecting what he already had. On June 28, 2025, in the biggest test of his career, Topuria faced Charles Oliveira for the vacant lightweight title. Oliveira, a former champion, a finishing machine, one of the most experienced fighters in UFC history. Topuria knocked him out in under 3 minutes, the fastest finish of his career, and became the first undefeated two-division champion the UFC had ever crowned. Think about how rare that actually is. 2 different weight classes, 2 different championship reigns, 0 losses anywhere in between. At that point, the only real conversation left was how high Topuria could climb on the pound-for-pound list, and whether anyone at lightweight or above had a real answer for him at all. What made Prime Topuria so difficult to deal with wasn't just one elite tool. It was the combination of all of them at once. The wrestling background from his years in Georgia gave him a base nobody could easily exploit. The jiu-jitsu black belt meant going to the ground with him was its own kind of danger, and the power in his hands meant that even a single mistake, anywhere in the fight, could end everything instantly. Opponents couldn't simply pick one area to attack. If they tried to out-wrestle him, he matched them. If they tried to outstrike him, the power gap punished them. If they tried to drag him into deep grappling exchanges, his jiu-jitsu was waiting. And on top of all of it, there was the mental side. Topuria walked into every fight having already told the world what was going to happen. That kind of self-belief is either delusional or it's terrifying. For 5 years, it was the second one. But of course, prime runs in this sport almost never end quietly, and Topuria's didn't either. On June 14, 2026, UFC brought a lightweight unification bout to this precedented, one-off event. Topuria, still undefeated at 17-0, defended his title against interim champion Justin Gaethje, a veteran knockout artist who had been chasing undisputed gold for years without ever quite getting there. For most of the fight, it looked like Topuria nearly stopped the fight between rounds. Topuria's own corner ultimately made the call. They threw in the towel before the 5th round. For the first time in his professional career, Ilia Topuria lost. The undefeated record was gone. The aura of invincibility that had carried him through 2 divisions was gone with it. And here's why that actually matters for how we should remember him, instead of erasing the run that came before it. Losing to Justin Gaethje in his very first lightweight title defense against a granite-chinned veteran who has given trouble to nearly everyone he's ever faced isn't a referendum on whether Topuria was ever great. It's a reminder that nobody, not John Jones, not Khabib, not anybody, gets to stay unbeaten forever once they keep choosing to fight the hardest possible version of the game. Because here's what Prime Topuria actually did, uninterrupted, for half a decade. He beat a grappling specialist before the grappling could start. He got hurt, came back and finished the job anyway. He submitted an undefeated wrestler. He knocked out a pound-for-pound great exactly the way he called it. He became the first man ever to finish a featherweight legend who had never been finished before. And then he moved up a full weight class and knocked out a former champion in under 3 minutes to do something no one in UFC history had ever done: become a 2-division champion without a single loss anywhere along the way. That's not a fighter who got lucky and ran into a soft stretch of opposition. That's a fighter who, at his best, looked like he had already solved the puzzle before the first bell even rang. So how good was PRIME Ilia Topuria? Good enough that for 5 years and 17 fights, the only people who believed he could lose were the ones who hadn't watched him closely enough. Good enough to call his own finishes against killers and legends, and then deliver on the promise. Good enough to become the first undefeated 2-division champion in UFC history, a feat that means greatness isn't about never losing. It's about how dominant you were before the loss ever had a chance to happen. And for one of the most confident, most complete, most quietly terrifying runs in modern MMA, PRIME Ilia Topuria earned every bit of the hype that came with it.